Hey, before we get started, I just want to ask for a quick favor. If you enjoy the video, please hit like and subscribe. It helps a lot and keeps these stories coming. Now, let's jump in. This one I received from Melina Mose from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Let's see what happened. Okay, so I have to tell you this, but it's going to sound a little nuts. I mean, even as I'm telling you now, I can't quite wrap my head around what happened, but I swear every word is true. You see, we moved into this house a few months ago, and let me tell you, it was supposed to be a fresh start for our family. My husband, Greg, and I had been talking for years about finding the perfect house, the one where we could raise our kids and finally settle down in peace. So when we found this place, it seemed like everything we dreamed of. It was in a nice neighborhood near a park, and the house was a beautiful old colonial style home. Big yard, lots of space, and best of all, the price was right. At first, I thought we'd lucked out. The moment I walked in, it felt like home. The hardwood floors, the large windows, and the cozy fireplace. Even my kids, Emma and Ben, loved it. Emma's 12 and Ben's 8, so they were already fighting over who would get the biggest room. It had that perfect family vibe, you know? The only thing that felt a little off was the basement. I'm sure you're thinking, what's the big deal about a basement? And you're right, but there was something about it that just felt wrong. At first, it seemed fine, just like any other basement, with storage boxes, old furniture, and some junk left behind by the previous owners. But there was this thick, musty smell that I couldn't quite shake off. The kind of smell you get when something's been sitting too long in a damp, dark place. And yeah, I get it. Basements are supposed to be a little musty. But this, it was almost like the air was too still down there, like it was holding on to something heavy. Still, we needed the space. Greg was talking about turning it into a family room or maybe even an office for me. So I pushed the weird feeling aside. I figured it was just a basement and I'd get used to it. But then came that one night. It was a Friday evening, and Greg had taken the kids to a nearby diner for dinner. I had a little time to myself to catch up on some work. I had this big project for my freelance writing gig, and I was feeling productive, so I decided to take a break and go down to the basement. It was about 8 p.m. when I went downstairs. I hadn't been down there much, just to throw a few things into storage, but this time I needed to move some boxes around. At first, everything seemed normal. The lights flickered a little, but that was nothing unusual. The bulbs were old. The basement had that damp smell again, and the walls were cold to the touch. But as I walked farther into the back of the basement, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the house creaking. It was old, after all. But the noise, it didn't stop. It sounded like scratching, like something was scraping against the walls. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to make my skin crawl. I froze for a second, holding my breath. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, so I turned off the basement light to listen more carefully. And there it was again, scratching, slowly, methodically, not from one spot, but moving around the walls. It sounded like something was dragging its nails across the concrete, searching for something. I was getting freaked out, but I told myself it was probably just a rat or something. That's what I convinced myself anyway. I mean, we live in an old house, and rats can be a real problem in the city, right? But even as I tried to rationalize it, the sound kept getting louder, closer. I grabbed the flashlight I kept in the drawer, thinking I might be able to see something. Maybe I'd find a mouse or a rat or even a pipe vibrating from the old plumbing. But when I aimed the beam toward the far wall, I froze. There, tucked into the corner of the basement, was something I hadn't noticed before. A door. I swear, I had never seen that door before. The basement was just one big open space, so how had I missed it? It wasn't a small door either. It was big, heavy-looking, made of dark wood, and had this rusty old handle on it that seemed almost too old for the house. I approached it slowly, feeling like I was in some sort of trance. My heart was racing, and the scratching sounds had stopped, but my ears were still ringing. I don't know why I did it, but I reached for the handle. It was freezing, even though the rest of the basement felt warm enough. The moment I turned it, the door creaked open on its own, like it was waiting for me. I stepped into a small room, barely big enough for me to stand in. The air down there felt even heavier than it had in the basement. It was suffocating, almost like the room was holding its breath, waiting for me to leave. There was nothing but a small, dusty table in the center of the room and a single chair. But that's not what caught my attention. On the table, there was something covered in a dusty cloth. I don't know why, but I walked over and pulled it back. Underneath, there was an old, weathered mirror. At first, I thought it was just some antique. It was a beautiful mirror, ornate with silver designs along the frame. But then, as I looked closer, I realized there was something wrong with it. I couldn't see my reflection. I mean, I could see part of it, but it wasn't right. It looked distorted. My face was blurry, like it was underwater. My eyes were too dark, and my smile was too wide. For a moment, I thought I was just tired, or maybe the lighting was messing with me. But the more I stared, the worse it got. My reflection, it wasn't me. It was like someone else, someone I didn't recognize. I slammed the cloth back down on top of it, my hands shaking. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't want to go back down there. I couldn't even think straight. I ran upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest, and locked myself in my bedroom. When Greg and the kids got home later that night, I didn't say anything. I didn't want to scare them. I mean, I didn't even know what happened myself, but that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that scratching sound in my head, even though the house was quiet. The next morning, I went down into the basement again. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but the door was gone. The spot where it had been was just the same old basement wall. No door, no room, nothing. I haven't been down there since. And honestly, I don't think I ever will again. I'm not sure what happened in that room or why it happened to me, but I know one thing. I'll never forget that mirror. And I'll never forget the feeling I had looking into it, like something was staring back at me, waiting. We ended up selling the house a few months later. It wasn't because of the basement. It wasn't because of the mirror. It was because we got an offer we couldn't refuse. But I think we all knew deep down that we needed to get out of there. The new family who bought the house, I didn't mention the basement. I didn't think they needed to know. But every time I think about it, I wonder if they ever went down there. This one I received from Mr. Paul down there in Queens, New York. Let's see what happened. All right, so this one's going to sound a little strange, but I swear to you, it happened exactly how I'm about to tell you. I've been working as a realtor in Manhattan for a while now, so I've seen it all. Luxury penthouses, sprawling brownstones, tiny studio apartments that cost more than a decent-sized house upstate. The thing is, when you deal with so many different properties, you get used to the weird stuff that can happen. People leave things behind in apartments. Sometimes they don't even want to talk about the history of the buildings, and there's always a few quirks in every place, whether it's an odd smell in the hallway or strange creaks coming from the floors. But what happened with this one property? I'll never forget it. It was an old brownstone in the West Village, right near Bleecker Street. I had just gotten a new listing, and this one was a bit of a fixer-upper. The owner was an older lady, probably in her mid-80s, and she had lived there for decades. The house had so much character, but it needed a lot of work. The floors were creaky, the wallpaper was peeling, and the basement, well, that basement was a mess. Still, it had potential. With the right renovations, it could be a real gem. The problem was, the lady didn't want to invest in any repairs before selling, so the house was listed as is. Now, it's not unusual for old brownstones to have basements. In fact, it's expected. They usually have storage, laundry rooms down there, maybe even a little den or office. But there was something off about this one. The first time I went down to take a look, I felt the air change the moment I stepped onto the stairs. It was like the temperature dropped by 10 degrees, and the deeper I went, the more it felt like something wasn't right. It wasn't even the dusty smell or the cobwebs. It was something else. Maybe it was the heavy silence, like the basement was holding its breath. But I'm a professional, right? I couldn't just stand there being weirded out. I had to sell this place, or at least show it to potential buyers, so I kept walking down the stairs. The lights down there were flickering, not in a way that was too dramatic, but enough to make you notice. The basement was large, bigger than you'd expect. The walls were lined with old wooden beams, and there was a strange, almost metallic scent in the air. It reminded me of wet iron or something. I didn't like it, but I assumed it was just old plumbing or maybe some rust from the old pipes. As I walked around, inspecting the space, I noticed something that stood out in the back corner. There was this heavy wooden door, looked like it led to a small room. It was partially open, but the air around it felt thicker, like something was blocking it. I thought it was just the way the door was hanging, but it made me pause for a second. Probably just some old storage room, I muttered to myself. I pushed the door open a little more, and that's when I saw it. A set of stairs that led even further down. To where? I had no idea. I mean, this place was old, so it was probably part of the original house design. Still, I was starting to feel this weird, unsettling sensation in the pit of my stomach, like I wasn't supposed to be there. But I had to keep it professional. This was my job. So I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures of the basement. I texted the owner and let her know I was going to get started with showing the house to some potential buyers, but I couldn't shake that feeling. A few days later, I had a couple of clients scheduled to come see the place. They were looking for a fixer-upper, something with character, and they were really into the idea of a brownstone with a backyard. The basement didn't seem to faze them when I showed them the main floor and upstairs. They even liked the fireplace and the big windows in the living room. But when we got to the basement, things started to get a little strange. The buyers, let's call them Jake and Lisa, seemed fine at first. They were walking around, talking about what they could do with the space. But when we got to that door with the stairs leading down, they hesitated. Lisa, the woman, looked a little nervous, like she was about to say something, but she didn't. Jake, though, he's the one who actually pushed the door open wider. I thought he was just being curious, so I didn't stop him right away. But the moment he stepped inside, his whole demeanor changed. He was a big guy, usually confident, but I could tell something was off. He looked over his shoulder at me, then at Lisa, and his face was pale. "I don't think I want to go down there," he said, his voice a little shaky. Lisa, who had been more quiet throughout the whole tour, suddenly spoke up. "What's down there?" I shrugged, trying to keep things casual. "Probably just an old storage room. There's nothing special, just some boxes or old junk." But they didn't seem convinced. They both glanced down the stairs like they could feel something was wrong. That's when I realized I hadn't told them about the extra stairs leading down. I wasn't sure if the previous owners even knew about it, and to be honest, I didn't want to mention it. It wasn't really part of the house as it was listed, and who knows, maybe I was just overthinking it. We left the basement quickly, but I could tell that neither of them was in the mood to explore the rest of the house. They still liked the place, but something about the basement had soured the mood. They thanked me and left earlier than planned. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something. Maybe it was just their reaction that got to me. Or maybe it was the way the basement felt. I decided to do a little more research. The next morning, I called the owner to ask if she knew anything about the strange basement room, and she sounded confused at first, like she had no idea what I was talking about. "Oh, that old room? I wouldn't go down there if I were you," she said, her voice suddenly tight. "That's where the old owner, my mother, used to keep some old things. It's just not worth messing with. Honestly, I haven't been down there in years." That was the first time she'd said anything like that, and it sent a chill down my spine. I had been hoping for some kind of backstory, a reasonable explanation, but what did she mean by old things? What was so bad that she never wanted to go down there? A few weeks later, the house was sold to another buyer, someone who seemed a little too eager to fix it up. They didn't even ask about the basement, which felt odd. But that wasn't the weirdest part. After the sale went through, I was clearing out some old paperwork at the office when I came across a report from a previous realtor about the house. According to the notes, there had been rumors about a tragedy involving the previous owner, the one who lived there before the lady I'd been dealing with. Apparently, there had been an accident involving a family member, something bad that happened in the basement. It wasn't exactly clear, but the fact that it was mentioned, well, it made everything about that basement feel darker. To this day, I have no idea what's really down there, but I'll tell you this. I won't be stepping foot in that basement again, and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. It's like there's something hidden there, something that's better left undisturbed. This one is from someone who chose to remain anonymous. Now grab your coffee and take a sip. Let's see what happened. Okay, so this one is a bit of a trip. I still don't know what to think about it, but here it is. It was my first year of college, and like every freshman, I was trying to get used to living away from home. I was staying in one of the older dorms on campus, the kind that had been around forever and looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. You know the ones, right? The rooms are small, the walls are thin, and the hallways always smell like old pizza and cleaning supplies. I didn't mind though. It was just temporary, right? I was there to study, meet new people, and experience college life. But there was this one thing about the dorm that always bugged me: the basement. Now, I'm not one to get creeped out easily. I mean, I'd heard the rumors about the place. Students would joke about it, say the basement was haunted or whatever, but I always thought that was just for fun. Like, you know how people will tell ghost stories around a campfire to scare each other? Same deal. The basement was just some place nobody ever went, and that was fine by me. I didn't really need to go down there. The laundry room was on the first floor, and I wasn't about to explore a dark, musty basement for no reason. Anyway, one night, I was coming back from a late study session at the library. It was past midnight, and I was dead tired, just trying to make it back to my room without falling asleep on my feet. As I passed the lobby, one of this fall this guy. I'm like, as I passed the lobby, I saw this guy from my chemistry class sitting on one of the couches. He looked like he had been there for a while, staring at his phone. I nodded at him as I passed, but he didn't even notice me. He was too busy tapping away at his screen. But then, out of nowhere, he looked up at me and asked, "Hey, you ever been down to the basement?" I don't know why he asked me that. Maybe it was the tiredness in his eyes or just the weirdness of the question, but it kind of caught me off guard. I told him, "No, not really. I don't think anyone goes down there." And I wasn't wrong. I hadn't heard a single person mention the basement, except as some weird joke about creepy things that live there. He leaned forward, and I swear he looked a little pale. "You should go down there sometime," he said. "Trust me, you'll want to see it for yourself." Then he got up, grabbed his backpack, and left without saying another word. That stuck with me the whole way back to my room. I couldn't shake it. Why would he say something like that? Was he messing with me, or was there something to it? But I didn't give it much thought. The next couple of days went by, and I figured I'd just forget about it. Then, 2 nights later, I was coming back late again. It was even later than before, around 2 a.m. Everyone else on the floor was probably asleep, and I was exhausted. The hallway was completely dark, except for the faint light coming from the emergency exit sign. I got to the elevator and pressed the button, but then, just before the doors opened, I heard a noise. It was this soft scraping sound coming from behind the basement door. The door was old, paint chipped, the metal rusted. It had one of those push bars to open it, but it was rarely used. I just stood there for a second, listening. The sound kept going. It was faint, but it definitely wasn't normal. I don't know what made me do it, but I put the door open just a little bit. And that's when I saw it. There was a set of stairs leading down, and the basement was darker than I could have imagined. But it wasn't just dark. There was this chill in the air, like something cold and unnatural. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I'm not usually one to get scared, but something about that place felt off. The sound was still there, coming from somewhere below, like something scraping against concrete. I started to back away, but before I could turn around, I heard something else. A soft voice, almost a whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough I could hear it. "Help me." I froze. I looked around, but no one was there. I didn't even hear footsteps. The building was dead silent. I glanced down the stairs, but it was too dark to see anything. I don't know why, but I felt this pull, like I had to go down there. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was that weird voice, but I took a step forward. The basement air hit me like a wall, cold and damp. I could barely see my hand in front of my face. As I descended the stairs, my shoes scraped against the concrete. The scraping sound was louder now, like something was dragging along the floor. I almost turned back right then, but I kept going, one step at a time. When I finally reached the bottom, the light flickered on. I didn't know how, but it was there. This weak, buzzing light that hung from the ceiling like it had been there for decades. The basement stretched out in front of me with rows of old wooden shelves and abandoned furniture. But something else caught my eye. There was a door at the far end of the room, one that looked different from the others. It was old, wooden, with a rusty handle. I don't know why, but I started walking toward it. Every step felt heavy, like I was walking through thick air, and as I got closer to the door, the air got colder. The scraping noise stopped. I reached for the handle, and it was freezing to the touch. I pulled it open. Inside was nothing, just an empty room. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. The walls of the room were covered in symbols, scratched into the paint, carved into the wood. They were all over, like someone had been drawing them with something sharp. The floor was covered in dust, but there were fresh footprints leading to the center of the room. I didn't want to stick around to figure out what those footprints meant. I backed out of the room and ran back up the stairs, heart pounding in my chest. When I got back to my dorm room, I locked the door and stayed up for hours, just staring at the walls. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there, something that shouldn't be. A couple of days later, I went to the dorm lobby to talk to that guy from chemistry class. I wanted to ask him if he knew anything else about the basement. But when I got there, I found out he'd dropped out of college and left town. No one knew why. I don't go near that basement anymore, and I'll be honest, I don't think I ever will. This one is from someone who also chose to remain anonymous. Now, take a sit and let's see what happened. So, you know how life goes sometimes. One minute, you've got everything, and the next, you're on the streets trying to find a place to sleep without getting hassled. That's how it happened to me, anyway. Things just fell apart. I used to have a little apartment, a job, the whole 9 yards. But one thing led to another, and bam, I was living out of a shopping cart. Now, I'm not saying it was all bad. I mean, yeah, it's tough out there, especially when winter hits. But I got used to it. You know, you figure out where the safe spots are, where people leave food, where you can sleep without getting bothered. It's like a whole different world, really. Anyway, there's this mall in town that's been closed for a while. Used to be nice, a lot of good stores and stuff. I didn't care much about it when it was open, but once it shut down, it became one of the few places where you could get some peace. There were plenty of other homeless people who used it, but we kept to our corners. The security guards didn't really bother us anymore. They'd show up sometimes, but the building was falling apart and they weren't as strict as they used to be. So a lot of people like me just started hang out there. The place was big and nobody really cared what you were doing. I had a spot near the food court. Usually I could find a corner where nobody would bother me. It was a decent place to sleep, even if it was a bit noisy sometimes with the wind howling through the broken windows. But every now and then, something would creep me out. There was this sound, like really faint, but it was always there. Tapping, like something hitting the walls. Or sometimes it sounded like footsteps, but no one was ever around. I'd hear it mostly late at night, when everything else was quiet. I tried not to think too much about it. I figured it was just the building settling or maybe rats running around. It's not like I had the luxury of being picky, but there was one night, man, that's when everything got weird. It was cold out, colder than usual. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and doesn't let go. I had just rolled up in my blanket and was trying to get some sleep when I heard it. This sound. It wasn't the usual taps or scrapes. This was different. It was like a dragging sound, slow and heavy. It was coming from the basement. I could hear it clear as day, even though I was a good ways away from that part of the mall. At first, I figured it was just some stray cat or maybe a couple of rats or something, but then it kept going and going. It was so persistent, so unnatural. I couldn't get it out of my head. It was like it was following me, making its way through the walls. I don't know what made me do it, but I decided to check it out. Maybe I was just being stupid, but I needed to know. So I got up and started walking down the hall toward the basement. It wasn't far. The mall's pretty big, but I knew the way. The basement door was at the end of a hallway near the old arcade section. The door had been there for as long as I could remember, but I'd never really thought much about it before. You could hear the elevator creaking from time to time, and sometimes I'd pass by and catch a glimpse of it. There was always this strange air around that door, though. Something about it made me hesitate. But that night, I didn't hesitate. I don't know why. Maybe it was the sound that had gotten into my head, but I felt this pull, like I had to know what was making that noise. I stood in front of the door for a minute, just looking at it. The old rusty metal handle was covered in dust, and the door itself looked like it hadn't been opened in years. There was no sign of anyone, no guards, no maintenance workers. It was just me and the silence. I grabbed the handle, and to my surprise, it opened right up. No squeak, no resistance. It was like the door was waiting for me to open it. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was colder, the kind of cold that doesn't go away. It wasn't just the chill from outside, this was something else, something wrong. I could barely see since the only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering every now and then. The basement was a mess, filled with boxes, broken furniture, and things that looked like they had been left behind for years. Everything was coated in dust, like no one had bothered to clean up down here forever. But it wasn't the mess that got to me. It was the feeling. The basement felt alive, like it had a pulse. The more I stood there, the more I felt like I shouldn't be there. I started to get this gut feeling, like I was being watched. I tried to brush it off, tell myself it was just the isolation messing with my head, but it didn't help. The longer I stayed, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I figured if I kept moving, I'd shake off the feeling, so I walked further in, trying to ignore the cold creeping through my clothes. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the basement, there was this weird thing. I don't even know how to describe it. It was like a pile of old blankets or clothes, but it was too still, too unnatural. It was stacked up against the wall, just sitting there, like it was waiting for me to come closer. The dragging sound, it stopped as soon as I saw it. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know if I should go closer. But my curiosity, stupid as it was, pushed me forward. I walked closer to the pile, feeling like I was walking through thick air. The closer I got, the more I could make out. It wasn't just a pile of blankets. There were shapes, small, jagged things tucked underneath the cloth, like bones or something. I couldn't make it out fully because the light barely reached that far, but I swear I saw eyes, little glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows. I don't know what happened next, but I just turned and ran. I didn't even look back. I could hear something, like a faint whisper, calling my name. It was low, almost like a hiss, but I didn't stop. I ran straight up the stairs, out of the basement, and back to the food court. I didn't care about the cold or the noise. I just needed to get away from whatever I had seen down there. The worst part? I never went back. I don't know if anyone ever did. I heard later that the mall was supposed to be demolished, but who knows? I never wanted to find out. Whatever was in that basement, it wasn't something I wanted to mess with. And now, every time I walk past that old building, I feel like something's still down there, watching. All right, so this one is a bit different. It's not a house, but it's just as creepy. Trust me. You know how working in corporate feels, right? The long hours, the sterile office buildings, everything just a little too polished, a little too perfect. I worked in this huge corporate office downtown, the kind of place where there's always a hum of activity and everyone's in a hurry. The building itself was one of those old ones that had been remodeled a few times over the years, but still kept its vintage charm. Like the kind of place you'd think was fine, but always felt off, you know? Anyway, so the company I worked for, let's call it Tech Corp, I don't want to get too specific, had this office in a building that was built back in the 80s. It had a ton of floors, and we were on the 15th. The offices were pretty nice, lots of glass walls and fancy meeting rooms. But the thing I noticed about the building was the basement. Nobody ever talked about it, but it was always there. The elevator buttons had a B for basement, but it didn't seem to work for anyone. Whenever you pressed it, nothing would happen. It wasn't until one Friday night, around 8 p.m., after everyone had left for the weekend, that I got curious. I was just finishing up some reports that were due Monday, and I was tired of staring at the same spreadsheet for hours. So I decided to take a break. I figured I'd take a little walk through the building, clear my head, maybe grab a coffee from the break room. As I was heading toward the elevators, I passed by the basement door. It was just this plain metal door with a simple sign that said, "Authorized personnel only." But there was no one around. I was already feeling kind of restless, and I thought, why not? I walked up to the door and tried the handle. Surprisingly, it opened, like it wasn't locked or anything. I stepped inside and immediately felt this rush of cold air. It was darker than I expected, and the smell hit me right away. It was musty, like old carpets and something that reminded me of wet concrete. The basement was huge, way bigger than I expected, and it felt empty. The lights flickered on as I stepped in, buzzing overhead. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a basement, after all, probably full of storage. But then I noticed something weird. There was this odd, thick carpet of dust on the floor, like no one had been down there in years. No surprise, right? It was just a basement. But as I walked deeper, the air felt wrong, like I was walking through a fog, but there wasn't any fog. I pulled out my phone to check the time, 9:15 p.m. Weird. I didn't think I'd been down there that long. The basement wasn't even that big, but I hadn't reached the end of the hallway. That's when I heard it. A sound. A low, faint scraping noise. At first, I thought it was just some pipes, the building settling, whatever. But the more I stood there, the more I realized it was something. More deliberate. I froze. The scraping was getting louder, like something was dragging across the floor, and it was coming from the far end of the basement. I couldn't make out what it was. I couldn't even see anything. The light didn't reach that far, and the air felt so thick that it made my head spin a little. My first instinct was to leave, but for some reason I didn't. I don't know why I didn't just turn around and go back upstairs. I kept walking, step by step. The scraping noise got closer, but there was nothing in sight. The light flickered again, and when it came back on, I saw it. Just for a split second, this figure. It was crouching in the shadows. It was tall, but hunched, its face hidden by long hair or a hood. I couldn't tell. I swear to God, it didn't move. It was just standing there, watching me. The temperature dropped. My breath started to fog up in the air. I stepped back, and the scraping noise started again. It was closer now. I turned and bolted for the stairs. As I made my way back to the elevator, I couldn't help but feel like something was right behind me, breathing down my neck. I pressed the button, but the elevator didn't come. Not at first. It was like time stopped for a moment. I reached for my phone, but I was too scared to look at it. My heart was racing in my chest. Then finally the elevator dinged, and I jumped inside with twice. When the doors closed, I looked around the lobby, and I swear I saw the same figure from the basement standing outside the glass doors. I thought I was losing it, so I called the security desk. No one answered. It was like the whole building had gone dead. I went home that night and didn't come back to the office for days. It wasn't until the following week, when I ran into Greg, one of the IT guys, that I found out something strange. He mentioned that the basement had been closed off a few years ago because of a safety incident. Apparently, there were some maintenance guys working down there, and one of them disappeared. No one knows exactly what happened to him, but after that, the building's management decided to seal off the basement for good. But here's the thing. I checked again. The basement door, the elevator, they were all back to normal, as if nothing had ever happened. And yet, every time I walk past that door, I can feel it, like something's waiting down there. What would you do? Would you gone down there? Let me know in the comments. I kept this story of 1400 words, sticking to a casual tone and